Jack had always done his best, working long hours at menial jobs that barely kept him afloat. The weight of responsibility was crushing him. Bills piled up, his kids needed new clothes for school, and his wife, Sarah, was growing more anxious with each passing day. The rent was overdue, the lights were flickering, and Jack could see the stress in Sarah's eyes. He loved her dearly, but no matter how hard he tried, he could never provide the life he had promised her. It was hard to watch his friends, the ones who had always gotten ahead without breaking a sweat, thriving in their easy lives. Jack was no criminal, but the frustration was wearing him down. Day after day, he did his best, but the world never seemed to give him a break. He wasn't lazy, but it always felt like the universe was pushing him down while others glided smoothly past him. Jack had worked in construction, then as a delivery driver, and now he was stuck in a dead-end job as a mechanic. He barely scraped by. One evening, after yet another long shift, Jack was walking home when he saw an unfamiliar sight: a sleek black limousine parked outside an extravagant mansion. He had seen this house before. It was owned by David Thompson, one of the wealthiest and most arrogant businessmen in town. Jack had heard the whispers. David had built his empire by stepping on anyone in his way. He flaunted his success at every turn, often belittling the less fortunate. His wealth made him untouchable, his arrogance palpable in every room he entered. Jack didn't know much about David, other than that he ran a successful chain of luxury businesses, and his mansion was a fortress. It was the kind of place Jack could only dream of entering. He had often driven past it, always wondering what it would feel like to be inside, to see the life of someone who had it all. But that night, as Jack observed the mansion from the outside, something struck him, a feeling that started as a flicker, but quickly grew into a fire. David had everything, but Jack had nothing. It was an unsettling thought, a dangerous one. He had heard stories of David's ruthless business practices, of his ability to crush anyone who dared stand in his way. He wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. There were no consequences for David. He had everything, and Jack had nothing. But what if that weren't true? What if there was a weakness? As Jack continued walking, a thought crept into his mind. A dangerous thought, the kind that could change everything. What if he could do something about it? What if he could seize the opportunity to change his life forever? He knew the mansion, its layout, its grandiose halls, and the heavily guarded entrances. But then it hit him, the vulnerability. David's mansion had a weak spot, a spot that was often overlooked, a gap in his perfect world, a back door, unguarded, a hidden entrance. Jack's heart raced. He felt a sick rush of excitement, as if a new path was opening up before him, one that would lead to a way out of his misery. He had nothing left to lose. His family, his life, everything was slipping through his fingers. Desperation clouded his thoughts, and for the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he had a chance. He was tired of working for pennies, tired of the system that had failed him. Maybe it was time to take control. Jack couldn't sleep for days after that fleeting thought took root in his mind. He'd spent the last few weeks obsessively watching David's mansion, studying the way the guards moved, learning the layout of the estate. Every night, Jack would sit at the kitchen table, his mind racing with calculations and possibilities. He didn't want to get caught, he couldn't afford to, but the temptation was powerful, stronger than any guilt or fear he'd ever known. He studied David's habits. Every Friday night, David hosted a lavish party at his mansion, a gathering of the city's elite. Jack learned that during these events, security relaxed. The partygoers were preoccupied with wine, laughter, and distractions. Jack knew this was his only chance. He marked the date on his calendar, and the plan was set. He spent hours mapping out every detail. The back entrance, weak, often overlooked, was his way in. He'd been to the mansion a few times, pretending to be a delivery man, just to get a feel for the place. The security cameras were fixed on the front, and the guards were busy with the guests at the front gate. Jack could slip in unnoticed through the side. His heart pounded with the rush of possibility. As the night of the party drew closer, Jack fought with his conscience. Was he really willing to cross this line? He thought about his family, his children, his wife, and how they deserved so much more. But with every passing day, his desperation deepened. The mounting bills, the overdue rent, Sarah's worried look. It was all too much. He needed a way out. He needed this. The evening of the heist arrived. Jack put on his disguise, a nondescript delivery uniform, something plain but believable. He parked his beat-up car a few streets away from the mansion and walked the rest of the way. As he neared the mansion, his pulse quickened. The music from the party thumped in the air, the laughter of guests mixing with the clink of glasses. It was perfect. He slipped through the side gate, unnoticed. The guards were too busy attending to the guests and making sure no one strayed too far from the party. Jack's every move was calculated. He took a deep breath and entered through the back door, heart racing, his palms sweating. He could hear the partygoers' voices echoing inside the mansion, oblivious to his presence. Moving through the darkened halls, Jack was careful to stay out of sight. The mansion's luxury was overwhelming, its marble floors and towering columns making him feel out of place. He was just a man, trying to survive, trying to escape. As he crept past rooms filled with expensive art and antiques, he couldn't help but wonder how much of David's wealth had come at the expense of others. But he shook the thought away. It wasn't about David, it was about him, about his family. Jack moved silently, avoiding security cameras and ducking behind pillars, each step bringing him closer to the vault. The tension was suffocating. Would the guards spot him? Would someone recognize him? But every time he thought he was close to being caught, he found another shadow to hide in, another moment to breathe. His nerves were on edge, and the thrill of the crime pulsed through him. Finally, Jack reached the vault room, hidden deep within the mansion. He could feel the weight of his actions, but there was no turning back now. He quickly broke into the vault, the lock giving way under his skillful hands. Inside, the room was filled with stacks of cash, gold, and priceless jewelry. The amount of wealth before him was staggering. For a moment, Jack felt like he was dreaming. This was the escape he had been waiting for. This was freedom. He grabbed as much as he could carry, bundles of cash, rings, and watches. But just as he was about to make his escape, a sound echoed through the hall, a door creaking open. Jack froze, his heart hammering in his chest. Someone was coming. Footsteps. Close. Too close. Panicking, he dove into a nearby coat closet, holding his breath as the footsteps drew nearer. His heart pounded in his ears, the sound deafening in the silence. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he pressed himself further into the corner, trying to stay as still as possible. His hands trembled, still clutching the stolen goods. Would he be caught? Would his life as he knew it end right here? The footsteps passed by, slow and deliberate. Jack didn't dare move a muscle. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. He waited, every nerve screaming for him to run, but he knew that any wrong move could give him away. Finally, the footsteps faded into the distance, and Jack exhaled in relief. But the tension hadn't passed. He still had to make it out. Jack's breath was still ragged as he sprinted down the hallway, clutching the stolen items tightly in his arms. The adrenaline coursed through his veins, drowning out the sound of his pounding heart. He had done it. He'd broken into the vault, stolen the wealth, and escaped undetected. He could hardly believe it. The exit was just ahead, another door, this one leading out to the back garden. He didn't look back. He slipped out into the night, keeping to the shadows as he made his way toward the garden gate. His hands were slick with sweat, but he held on to the stolen goods tightly. His mind raced with the thrill of the heist, of the danger he had narrowly avoided. As he reached his car, he jumped in, started the engine, and sped away from the mansion. The roar of the engine seemed to echo in his ears as the mansion receded into the distance. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see flashing lights, but there was nothing. No sirens, no police. It was over. He had pulled off the perfect crime. The weight of the stolen wealth felt heavy in his hands, but the rush of victory was even heavier. Jack leaned back in the seat, letting out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of the situation began to sink in. The thrill of escaping the mansion started to give way to an unsettling feeling in the pit of his stomach. He'd stolen from one of the wealthiest men in the city, a man with vast resources and connections. What if David had already figured it out? What if the police were already swarming the mansion? Suddenly his phone buzzed. Jack's eyes flicked to the screen, his breath catching in his throat. The message was from an unknown number. Did you really think you could get away with it? His pulse spiked. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. He immediately checked his rearview mirror again, his mind racing. He couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. No flashing lights, no police vehicles. But his paranoia was escalating. Just then, his phone buzzed again. But this time, it was a news alert. Breaking, local billionaire's mansion targeted in a high-profile robbery. Authorities are on the scene, but the suspect is still at large. A cold wave of fear washed over him. The police were already there. How long had it been since he left the mansion? 10 minutes? 15? The stolen wealth felt like a weight he could no longer bear. His hands shook as he gripped the wheel tighter. Was it just his paranoia, or was someone following him? He tried to shake the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. He pulled into a dark alley and parked his car, turning off the engine. For a moment, he sat still in the silence, staring out at the empty street. The adrenaline that had fueled his escape was beginning to drain from his system, leaving behind only dread. He looked at the bags filled with cash and jewelry sitting on the passenger seat. His mind flashed back to the moment in the mansion when he nearly got caught. The fear, the close call, it had all seemed worth it in the heat of the moment. But now, with every second that passed, the victory felt more hollow. Jack tried to push aside the guilt, but it kept creeping up on him. He had crossed a line. He had stolen from someone who had more money than he could ever imagine. But was that enough? Was it worth the risk, the danger, and the possibility of a life on the run? He glanced at the stolen goods, imagining how they would change his life. He could buy a new house, pay off his debts, make his family's life better. He could finally escape the suffocating grip of poverty. But the joy of those thoughts was quickly overshadowed by the reality of what he had done. He had taken something that wasn't his, something that had cost someone else, someone far more powerful, a lifetime of work. The enormity of his actions began to sink in. What if David came after him? What if the police traced his every step? The weight of the guilt pressed harder against him. Jack knew he had made a choice, but was it the right one? He had stolen not just from a man, but from an entire system that had wronged him, had held him down for years. But no matter how he tried to rationalize it, the truth was clearer than ever. There was no going back. He took a deep breath and opened the car door, stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were eerily quiet. As he looked down at the bags of stolen wealth, Jack knew he was standing at a crossroads. Would he embrace the life of luxury he had always dreamed of? Or would he come to regret the choice that had changed everything? The morning after the heist, Jack woke up to an unsettling silence. For the first time in what felt like ages, he had no pressing deadlines, no bills to pay. His mind should have been at ease, enjoying the luxury he'd stolen. But instead, a knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. The weight of the stolen goods was beginning to feel like a burden rather than a victory. At first, Jack didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. He drove to a nearby shopping mall to buy a few new things for himself, clothes, a watch, a car. But as he walked through the aisles, something about the atmosphere felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, but when he turned around, no one was there. It was a nagging feeling that only deepened when he returned home. That afternoon, as Jack was relaxing in his living room, the phone rang. He jumped at the sound. A number he didn't recognize flashed on the screen. "Hello," Jack answered cautiously. A deep, gravelly voice replied, "You think you're safe, don't you?" Jack's blood ran cold. His heart skipped a beat. "Who is this?" The voice was calm, almost amused. "You can't hide from David. His people are already looking for you. You should have known better." Jack's hands trembled as he hung up, his mind racing. His stomach churned with dread. David. Of course, David would have people. Private investigators, a network of security experts. He was powerful, untouchable. It didn't take long for him to realize he'd made a grave mistake. A chill ran down his spine as he stared at the phone. What had he gotten himself into? Every hour after the call felt like a countdown to disaster. Jack couldn't ignore the creeping paranoia that clung to him. It wasn't just about the police anymore. David had the resources to track him down. He could send people to his house. He could destroy Jack's life in a matter of hours. As night fell, the tension grew unbearable. Jack locked all the doors and checked the windows. It felt like the walls were closing in around him. Every knock at the door made him jump, and every shadow outside his window seemed to move. He pulled the curtain shut, his pulse quickening. He didn't know who was out there, but he could feel eyes on him, someone watching his every move. The next day, a black SUV parked a few houses down. Jack noticed it as he pulled into his driveway, his heart hammering in his chest. The tinted windows revealed nothing, but the vehicle lingered for hours. It was there, watching, waiting. Was it the police? Was it David's men? His mind spun with possibilities, each one worse than the last. By now, Jack had been up for 48 hours straight, trying to find some way to escape the mounting pressure. He couldn't go to the police. He was too deep in the mess. But the fear was suffocating. What had once been a dream come true was now a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Then came another phone call. This time the voice on the other end was different. Calm, almost soothing, but Jack didn't trust it for a second. "Mr. Jack," the voice said, "we've been watching you. We know where you are. It's only a matter of time before David gets to you. It's not the police you should be worried about." The line went dead. Jack's hands shook as he held the phone, his thoughts racing. Every sound in his house felt amplified, every knock on the door a death sentence. The paranoia was eating him alive. David had men everywhere. His reach was limitless. The world that once seemed so grand and promising was closing in on him, suffocating him. Desperation grew in Jack's chest. He began to make plans, each one more drastic than the last. He couldn't stay here much longer. The tension in his life was building to a breaking point. Every moment felt like a countdown. David was closing in, and Jack had no idea how much longer he could stay one step ahead. But just as he thought he had a moment of peace, a sound from outside his window froze him in place. Footsteps. Slow. Methodical. Someone was approaching the house. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as his mind raced. His breath became shallow, his vision blurred with panic. Was it the police? Was it David's men? Had they finally found him? The footsteps stopped right outside his door. Every second felt like an eternity as Jack waited, his hands gripping the edge of the table. He had to act fast. The clock was ticking, and there was no more time to hide. David leaned back in his leather chair, a cold smile playing at the corners of his lips. His office was dimly lit, the sharp lines of modern art and the polished surfaces casting reflections like a world he controlled, not just a room. He watched Jack closely, his eyes sharp, scanning every movement. Jack sat across from him, uneasy, wondering how much longer he could stay calm as the tension crackled in the air. "You know," David said slowly, his voice carrying a quiet menace, "I knew it was you the moment I saw the footage. You were sloppy, too careful to be a real professional. You made sure not to get caught, but you left clues, little things that didn't add up. I knew something was off from the start." Jack's stomach tightened. His throat felt dry, his pulse racing. He had always known there was a possibility that David would find out who had stolen from him, but he hadn't anticipated this level of control. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. David leaned forward, his gaze unflinching. "You see, Jack, I wasn't just a victim in all this. I knew you'd come. I knew you'd take the bait. I've been watching you for months, waiting for the right moment to test you." Jack's breath hitched in his chest. He didn't understand. Was this all a game to David? A test? The idea that someone had been watching him, planning this from the start, made his skin crawl. "You think you were stealing from me," David continued, his voice dripping with amusement. "But the truth is, I orchestrated this entire thing. From the moment I saw you struggling, from the moment I saw your desperation, I knew you were the perfect person to steal from me. I saw potential in you, Jack." Jack's mind reeled. What was he saying? How could he possibly have known? "You set this up?" Jack finally managed, disbelief thick in his voice. David's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Oh, yes. I planted the weakness, the vulnerabilities in my mansion. It wasn't hard considering how desperate you were. You were never going to resist. I knew you'd do it. And now here we are." The room seemed to close in on Jack. the weight of David's words crashing over him. His entire life had been manipulated like a puppet on strings. The feeling of victory he had experienced the night of the heist was nothing more than a cruel illusion. The money, the escape, none of it had been real. David had seen it all coming. David smiled, sensing Jack's growing unease. "You were never meant to win, Jack. I wanted to see if you had the guts to go through with it. I wanted to test you, and you passed. You stole from me, but what I've really been looking for all along isn't just a thief. It's someone like you, a man willing to cross every line for a shot at something better." Jack's confusion deepened. "What do you want from me?" David's smile widened. "I'm offering you a chance, Jack. You're in deep now. You're already entangled in my world. But I can offer you more than you could ever dream of on your own. I see potential in you. I'm offering you a job. Join my empire. Work for me, and together, we can build something that will make this little heist look like child's play." Jack stared at him, his mind spinning. A job? After everything he'd done? After everything he'd risked? What kind of world was this, where stealing from a billionaire led to an offer like this? David had turned everything upside down. His desperation, his need for money, his sense of failure. They had all been carefully anticipated. Jack had been nothing more than a pawn in David's game. David leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "But here's the catch, Jack. You join me, you work for me, you become part of my world. You'll have wealth beyond your wildest dreams, but you'll never be able to escape it. You'll do things you never imagined, things that will change you forever. But you'll be rich. You'll have power. You'll never have to worry about being poor again." The room felt suffocating, the offer both a lifeline and a trap. Jack's mind raced, torn between the temptation of wealth and the knowledge that accepting David's offer would mean surrendering himself to a life he couldn't undo. Could he really walk away from everything he had worked for? Could he throw away the possibility of a life that was better than he had ever imagined? David's eyes gleamed with something like victory. "So, Jack, what do you say? Will you take the deal?" Jack stood in front of David, the weight of the decision pressing on him like an unbearable burden. The offer lay before him, sparkling with the allure of wealth, power, and luxury, a life he had only ever dreamed of. But with it came a price, one that gnawed at his conscience. Was it worth it? Could he live with himself knowing that he would be forever indebted to a man like David, someone who viewed people as mere pawns in his ruthless game? The thought of never having to worry about bills, about his children's future, about Sarah's anxious glances, those thoughts tugged at him, urging him to take the easy road. The idea of joining David's empire, living a life where he could finally be respected, finally be someone important, was intoxicating. But at what cost? Would he lose himself in the process? Would he become just like David, cold and calculating, willing to trample over anyone to get ahead? Jack glanced down at the money, the stolen wealth, now just a symbol of the trap he had walked into. His heart pounded in his chest as he weighed the consequences. He had already crossed a line by stealing, by betraying his own morals, but this was different. This was selling his soul. As he looked up at David, Jack's resolve began to solidify. This wasn't the life he wanted. He didn't want to be another cog in David's machine, another tool to help build an empire founded on greed and manipulation. He didn't want to be like the men who used their power to break others down, who reveled in the destruction of those who were weaker. He wanted something more than this. He wanted to build his own future, even if it meant taking the hardest road possible. With a steady voice, Jack spoke, his words carrying the weight of his decision. "I'm not interested in your empire, David. I don't want your wealth. I don't want to live a life that's been built on the suffering of others. You've been playing with people's lives, with their hopes, all for your own gain. I won't be part of that." David's eyes flickered with a hint of surprise, but his smirk never wavered. "You think you can just walk away from this, Jack? You've already crossed a line. There's no going back. You think you can keep living your life like nothing happened?" Jack didn't flinch. "I'll face the consequences, whatever they may be, but I'm done being part of your game." He turned on his heel and walked toward the door, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the grand hallway. His heart was pounding, his mind racing with what would come next. Would David send the police after him? Would his life be ruined? The thought was terrifying, but it was also liberating. Jack was no longer running from the truth. He was ready to face it. As Jack reached for the door handle, ready to step out of David's mansion for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was all far from over. He turned the handle, but just as the door creaked open, he heard a sound that froze him in place. The unmistakable click of a camera shutter. He stopped and turned around slowly, his heart skipping a beat. David was standing there, the smirk on his face now more knowing than ever. "You didn't think I would let you leave without a little parting gift, did you?" David's voice was smooth, calm, and utterly controlled. Jack's stomach dropped as he realized the truth. He hadn't been making this decision alone. From the moment he stepped foot in this house, David had been watching, listening, recording. Jack had been nothing more than a pawn in a game he hadn't even known he was playing. David continued, his voice cold and calculating. "I knew you'd turn down the offer. I knew you couldn't resist playing the hero. But I wasn't testing your loyalty, Jack. I was testing your desperation. And now the world will know exactly who you are." David's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he revealed the final twist of the game. "You see, Jack, this wasn't just about the theft. This was about you. I've recorded every move you've made, every lie, every choice, and now it's all going to come out. You've stolen from me, and now everyone will know the truth." Jack's world seemed to collapse in an instant. His face turned pale as he realized what David had done. The evidence, the footage, everything was in David's hands. Jack had been played from the very beginning, and now there was no escape. As Jack stood there, his heart racing, he saw the final blow. David had already made sure that the world would know about his crime. There was no running from it, no hiding. The moment Jack had chosen to reject David's offer, he had sealed his fate. The camera clicked again, capturing the moment of Jack's defeat. The door was wide open now, but Jack couldn't move. He had thought he was walking away, but in reality, David had already won. The last shot lingered on Jack's face. Confusion, fear, and realization all crossing his features in rapid succession. As he came to terms with the true nature of David's manipulation. He had never been meant to win.